Welcome back. We're here again with Tim Price, Mike Butler, and Chris Strevel, professors at Christ College. We're going to be talking about the development of warfare in the history of mankind. Currently, right now, as I'm sure all of you are aware, the U.S. is engaged in two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And recently in Egypt, Hosni Mubarak has stepped down. He was the American-funded dictator of that country. There are riots going on in Yemen, Bahrain, Libya, and there are big changes happening in the Middle East. The U.S.'s role, as I said earlier, is that we're engaged in two wars in that region. And I wonder if, Tim, you might give us just a brief outline historically of the development of warfare in mankind, in the history of mankind, and how we got to this point, how America got to the point where we're now embroiled in the Middle East, such as we are.
Yeah, in order to get your background idea of what is actually going on in the Middle East generally, and I'm not just talking about what's going on right now, but what has been going on throughout most of the last half of the 20th century and into the 21st century, there has to be a real broad backdrop of how warfare has developed and the politics of warfare has developed with regard to the movements that society has taken place. And a good starting point there really would be the medieval period, because war was a matter of particular attention to the Christian nations of Europe in the early formation of medieval Europe. And one of their ideas was that if Christian nations are going to be fighting with Christian nations, then they have to make warfare as humane as they possibly can. And so a lot of the chivalric codes that were put together throughout Europe became the basis of rules of engagement, rules of warfare, things of that sort, international treaties of war and so forth that would develop later on. And it actually put more of a humane touch on war. The casualties of those wars was what we would call relatively low. Mm-hmm. And the kind of fallout that goes into the civilian population was also kept down to a very low limit, because war was considered that, it was considered that war needed to be done in its place, and mm-hmm. And should not be to the destruction of the city life and of the civilian life and so forth. But as you begin to move into the industrial period, around the end of the 18th century and throughout the 19th century into the Napoleonic period, industry begins to change the not only the logistics of war, but the way in which war is engaged. And so you have higher casualty rates, you have a lot more technological developments that are being incorporated into war theory. Mm-hmm. And this is going to lead you through the 20th century and really culminates in World War I and World War II, which are highly technological wars. And then as more social developments begin to take place in the 20th century, leading to the socialization of America, the Cold War period, where you have nuclear warfare, and not just nuclear warfare, but that your nation is not totally sure of itself. It's not totally sure of the theories that hold that nation together. Paranoia begins to rise, and basically what you do is you begin to look at war not so much as the last ditch tool in international development, but you begin to look at it as a tool for security. Mm-hmm. And security developments in warfare have led to the theories of preemption. Mm-hmm. Basically, the perceived threat. If there's a perceived threat, then warfare is okay because of your protection of your own securities and so forth. And since you've got an international body right now that actually supports the idea, then you're going to have various countries that are running around and interfering in each other's affairs in accordance with whatever pattern of international law is there, and that according to what philosophies are prevailing at that time. America, because America is dominant, has kind of taken the place as the police state.
Mm-hmm.
So these interferences that you're going to see in the Middle East and other places are drawn out of that theory. And so when you do your interpretation on things that you see in current events, you have to start with that, and then there are a lot of other complicated things that you add into it. But that's your main background.
This highlights for us the question of just warfare and what constitutes a just war. We talked earlier about biblical epistemology and the presuppositions that the Scriptures give us for making judgments of this kind. In the church, in evangelicalism, there is a lot of flag waving with the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, and there are many people who enlist in the military, and there doesn't seem to be much discernment when it comes to drawing the line to say, are we engaged in a just war? So I wonder if, Chris, you might give us a definition of what, biblically speaking, what is a just war, as far as we can say, and do you think the wars that we're engaged in meet that criteria?
Well, in many respects, just war would be very parallel to the same principles of self-protection or family protection.
Mm-hmm.
You are defending yourself against the attacks of an enemy. Just like in the Bible, you cannot, or in the case laws of the Old Testament, you cannot randomly shoot someone that you feel like may be a threat to you. He has to be in your house at night where you have no way to determine what his true motives are, and you shoot to kill.
Mm-hmm.
There's not I see somebody walking down the street, he looks bad, he might have something against me, therefore put the crosshairs on him and let him have it. You might also think of, so self-defense.
Mm-hmm.
You might also think of a nation that you're in a legitimate treaty, alliance type
Mm-hmm.
relationship
Mm-hmm.
with. If they have a legitimate threat to their self-defense and you are aligned to them legitimately, and of course, if this was a Christian nation, then we would only align ourselves with Christian nations economically, politically, militarily, etc. Then that would be a possibility as well of just war. I do not believe any war that the United States has fought in the last, well, I won't give a date, but none of the wars we're currently fighting meet the criteria of being a just war.
Well, one thing that's important about balancing off something Chris said is that it's very difficult for a people that have very strong feelings for their country to look back and make judgments that go against some of the policies that we've had, and particularly international policies, and particularly the wars that we've been engaged in. So this is where biblical epistemology comes in once again. It's everywhere, because we can't base our views on warfare on, well, we're a good country, we're trying to do good things, and we're trying to protect the underdog, whatever the justification has been. We just can't allow ourselves to justify wars ex post facto because we were engaged in them.
Yeah.
So if you look back, and most of the war in the 20th century, wars that we've been in fact, every one of them does not meet that criteria. I mean, basically, Chris said, it's defensive wars. If we are being attacked, then that we have a right, anybody has the right to defend themselves. That's not the only thing that goes into it. I mean, there's a time where if you're being overwhelmed by a huge opponent, then it's probably best to simply capitulate.
Yeah.
Unless the results of capitulation can be very clearly seen as complete destruction of your people. In that case, you fight to the last man. But if it's some, the Romans, for example, would come in and pretty much, they were going to conquer. And most of the people fought them, but eventually they capitulated because they knew that the alternative was was annihilation. And so if we're facing that, you have the right to defend yourself. But if you're facing annihilation, and nobody wants to be under the Roman imperial eagle, but it's better than the annihilation of the people. There are some benefits. So there's a lot of things that go into this, but it's crucial that when we look at wars, that we abstract ourselves or pull ourselves away from the love of our country, of what has gone on before, and simply look at it and say, you know what, on biblical principles, we should not have been, or we should not be now fighting these wars.
That's a good point that you brought up, and that leads into the last point I want to talk about, actually directed at you on this question. When we deal with the wars that our state is engaged in, and the reports that we receive of those wars through the media, there is a lot of propaganda to sift through. Even when you read the history books, there's a lot of propaganda that, as you said, ex post facto justifies these wars because we're engaged in it. I wonder if you might talk about the power of propaganda and the necessity of Christians to be thinking clearly about these issues. And as you already talked about briefly, how biblical epistemology ties into that.
Well, I mean, propaganda and warfare go hand in hand. I mean, there's always been, Caesar's Gallic Wars.
Yeah.
Pure propaganda. Lots of good historical things that we learn in there, but Caesar is basically showing why he's doing this, spinning events to make him look good, building up the Celtic enemy as somebody that is a threat. Looking back on their own history, the Celts did sack Rome a few hundred years before that, and so building up on all these things, the war propagandists will say we need to do these things, and we all need discernment, right? There's always a motive behind things. So the United States has pool reporters. They've had this since the First World War, especially the Second World War, and they're basically taking the shots, getting the interviews, writing the reports from the field that are going through several filters before they get to the papers. I like what C.S. Lewis says. He doesn't even read the papers because he says by the time, he was in the First World War, and he says by the time it gets through all the way up the chain back to the papers, the thing has been mangled so badly that you can't trust really what's going on. And we shouldn't be cynical, but we should be very skeptical. There's every motive to make our cause look good and make the enemy look bad. We go into a foreign nation, and when they fight back, they are terrorists, they're insurgents, right? But if somebody were coming into our nation or another friendly nation and attacking them, they would be freedom fighters, right? Resistant fighters, right? And so even the way in which we label things has a lot of rhetorical charge to it. And so we just need to this is where we need to think as Christians. We need to, I strongly believe, we look back upon our heritage. We are not Christians divorced from the people we are or nation. There is a place for patriotism and things like that, but those things cannot blind us. We need to understand that much of the stuff that we hear coming from the field reporters is coming through a number of filters, and what's going on there and what we're hearing are generally two different things. I learned this being in a foreign country when events were going on and seeing it firsthand, and then coming home and people would ask me, well, what was it like there? It must have been like this, and it wasn't like that at all. That's just and that's a lot of this is innocent. It's just simply people build things up, and people see certain things that aren't, maybe they generalize when they shouldn't, but a lot of it is propaganda. And the military and the news reporters, the big news vehicles today are very closely linked, and that's always been the case. And so we just need to be careful about what we're hearing and believing everything we hear.
Yeah, it's good to understand that there's been a long history of collusion between military and news media all the way back to the Spanish-American War. So this has a long context.
This has been a discussion of the ethics of just war. Next time we'll be talking about the history of the Constitution.